Welcome to Recovery Radio by Landmark Recovery with your host, Zach Crouch. In this program, we'll discuss the root causes and treatments of alcohol and substance addiction, speak with experts in related fields, and help navigate the road to recovery. Now, here's the host of Recovery Radio, Zach Crouch.
Hi, I'm Zach Crouch, and you're listening to Landmark Recovery Radio, your source for addiction and recovery news and knowledge. You can find us online wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to get the most up-to-date information from leading experts. We have guest Dr. Joseph Shrand joining us on the show today. He currently serves as the Chief Medical Officer of Riverside Community Care in Dedham, Massachusetts. He is a lecturer of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He's also an adjunct faculty at Boston Children's Hospital, is the creator of Drug Story Theater. He is triple board certified in adult psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and he's also a diplomat of the American Board of Addiction Medicine. Among colleagues and staff, he's affectionately known as Dr. Joe, as he was Joe in the original cast of the children's PBS series Zoom. Dr. Joe will be talking with us today about adolescent brain development and why the brain is at such a high risk for addiction during this stage. Dr. Joe, it is a pleasure to have you on, sir.
Zach, it is a delight to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I want to get into this a little bit because it's a topic that's certainly of interest to me as I have young children, and it will at one point be adolescents, of course. What puts the adolescent brain at a higher risk for addiction than a fully developed adult brain?
The way to think about adolescent brain development is to follow evolution in some way. So let's think about the brain as a 3-scoop ice cream cone. Okay. So the cone itself is like the spinal cord going down to the rest of the body. Then sitting on top of that, the first scoop of ice cream is the brain stem. And that is the part responsible for everything automatic, for heart rate, breathing, all the things that you don't think about. On top of that is a structure called the limbic system, which has a lot of different parts to it. But in essence, the limbic system is responsible for emotions, for irrational thought, for impulses, for pleasure, for memory. That's the part of the brain where addictions happen to start. Mm-hmm. And then the third scoop of ice cream is this huge chunk of brain, the new brain, new cortex brain, our new brain. This part of the brain distinguishes us as mammals. And if you put your hand on your forehead, anybody who's listening, if you're driving, don't do this, but if you're not, then just put your hand on your forehead. Right behind there is your prefrontal cortex. A fancy way of saying the front part of your brain. That part of the brain is responsible for rational thought, for solving problems, executing a plan, and anticipating what will happen next. How many times have you done something limbically, impulsively, and slapped your forehead as if you're trying to jumpstart your prefrontal cortex? Right?
Yeah.
So
a lot.
A lot, right? The brain matures from the bottom up. A lot of people say the brain matures from the back to the front. That is true in some degree, but the part about addiction that's interesting is that the brain is maturing from the bottom up. And we measure brain maturation by measuring something called myelin, another sort of medical term. But imagine that the brain is just a whole bunch of electric wires. In order for the electric impulse to travel from one part of that wire to the other, it needs a covering, an insulation. And that insulation has the fancy name called myelin. Now, the brain is partly myelinated at birth, but the brain stem got to be ready to go, right? The brain stem myelinated, ready to go, because babies that are born without brain stems that are working aren't breathing and they're not regulating, so they don't make it. And, we've all seen babies squiggling around, but they're not slam dunking basketballs. But they're squiggling because part of the motor cortex that's right at the top of the brain is partially myelinated. It's mature enough so that they can move around, move their mouth, grab onto something, swallow food. But they're not slam dunking basketballs.
Right.
So, long-winded answer to your question. Let me say right at the beginning, Zach, that this may happen because you have made a mistake. And the mistake is you have asked the psychiatrist to talk. Okay? Psychiatrists, we usually listen. So when we do get a chance to talk, we don't stop talking.
Right.
But to answer your question, why is the adolescent brain at higher risk?
Mm-hmm.
So think about this. The brain is maturing from the bottom up. That means that the limbic system, the impulsive part of the brain, is more in control of the adolescent than the prefrontal cortex. So they can start using drugs without thinking about the future and what will happen next. So that's really the risk. But the risk is mind-blowing. Let me just tell you. So if you start using drugs or alcohol after the age of 21,
right,
1 out of 25 people are at risk for lifelong addiction. 4 out of 100 start using after the age of 21, that's your risk. 1 out of 25 are at risk for lifelong addiction.
Okay.
But if you start using before the age of 18, that number goes from 1 in 25 to 1 in, and we'll take a small pause for the audience to shout out their guesses.
1 in 10?
1 in 4.
What?
1 in 4. Think about that. 1 in 4 kids who start using drugs or alcohol before the age of 18 are at risk for lifelong addiction just because the way the brain is developing. Addiction is not about morality. It's about mortality. It's just the way the brain works. This is really important because we struggle with stigma.
Mm-hmm.
We struggle with the fact that people who use drugs and alcohol, they're somehow corrupt and immoral and bad. No. It's about the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I have, okay, so I have some questions as follow-up to that wonderful explanation. I love the idea of thinking of the brain as a ice cream cone. I think that it just makes sense. It people like me who aren't medical, who want to understand this better, can really understand that well. I'm curious to know, in terms of what we were talking about, the top scoop, like the third scoop, how far in development is this new thought brain, in terms of the overall evolution of the brain?
Well, it's probably several millions of years old, but the part below it, the reptilian brain, is much, much older. So this new brain, mammals are really the source of the new brain. So think about mammalian evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Several hundreds of millions of years old, certainly in some degree, but us as humans, we know it's only 5-7 millions of years old. But what really happened is, I'm really glad you asked this, because somewhere along the line, another part of the brain developed, also in the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for this thinking, but it's also responsible for something called theory of mind. Now, this is not theory of evolution. It's not theory of quantum mechanics. It's called theory of mind because we can't see somebody else's mind. So we have to theorize and guess. What are they thinking or feeling? It's about empathy. It's what distinguishes us as a social animal. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that what we really want to know is not just what are you thinking or feeling, but what we really want to know is what are you thinking about me? What do you think about me? And this gets back to an even deeper part of evolution, which is being the social animal. Mm-hmm. Millions of years ago, we weren't the biggest animal, we weren't the fastest, we weren't the strongest. We were these isolated mammals scurrying around, hoping not to be lunch. Right. We were prey. And then we formed these small social groups. And our survival potential increased so dramatically that human beings are everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to maintain the protection of that group, the safety of that group, you have to contribute something, which means you have to have value. And think about this. Think about every person you've ever met in your life. What's the common thread that binds us all? We just want to feel valued by someone.
Mm-hmm.
Let's come back to this later on, because it has a huge part in how we can help protect kids ever going down that path of addiction.
I want to ask a question as a follow-up to I was thinking more about this idea of being a social animal, right? And there's been several things. I think Brene Brown's probably done some work on this, but there's also been podcasts and also some TED Talks on the idea of how important attachments are as social animals, which we are. It's important to understand that, is it not? Because I think that, what recovery support groups and what people in treatment and et cetera, people in the recovery process do is they begin to form healthy attachments. Now, I want to throw this in as a caveat to the question. How does that change when working with adolescents? Because we're talking about a developing brain, and, adolescents are, very insular, I think, and they're, you're either in our group or outside our group. And if you're older than us, then we're going to have some suspicion about, like, what are you trying to really do here? Which I think makes working with adolescents so challenging. But I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I'm a child psychiatrist, and I work with adolescents. One of the things when I give lectures on this stuff, to adults, not to adolescents, but to adults, I'll say, how many people out there have adolescent children? And, a bunch of people raise their hands. I'll say, how many people have been adolescents? Of course, right? Everybody snickers. And then I say, how many people are still adolescents? And I raise both my hands. Because part of me still thinks like that. This a little bit impulsive, but also still able to think about the future a little bit. Right. But this is why I've developed this thing called drug story theater, which is adolescents talking with adolescents. It's peer-to-peer. Because you're right. Adolescents may absolutely not listen to a white-haired old guy like me, but they also know one thing. They know that I respect them. Mm-hmm. And they know that means I value them. Respect leads to value. Mm-hmm. And value leads to trust. Mm. And with trust, you can share your secrets, because secrets aren't secrets because of what we've done. Secrets are secrets because we worry, how will someone judge me if they know my secret? That's the theory of mind. Will they judge me as less valuable and kick me out of my protective group? Mm. So the adolescent is very tuned into this. They are absolutely tuned into the social aspect of who they are and what other people are thinking about them. And this leads to one of the great risk factors for first-time substance use that can put this kid potentially on a lifelong course of addiction. One of the great risk factors for first-time substance use is low self-esteem. Think about that. Low self-esteem. Why is that? Because the brain wants to feel some pleasure. And again, to get into some of the neurobiology of this, addiction really comes down to one main brain chemical, dopamine. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All drugs and alcohol force the brain to make dopamine. It is an ancient chemical of pleasure. You can take a snail and chop it up, and you can extract dopamine, because the dopamine is what will orient the snail to light and to food. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So dopamine, all drugs and alcohol force the brain to make dopamine. But there's another chemical of pleasure. It's called oxytocin, not OxyContin, oxytocin.
Thank you for clarifying that.
I wanted to clarify that. Oxytocin is the chemical that's released when somebody says you're amazing. When they say, Zach, this is the best show I've ever heard, and you get that rush, that feeling, that's oxytocin. But here's what you need to know.
Mm-hmm.
Dopamine interferes with oxytocin. Think about that for a moment. Dopamine
is it more powerful than oxytocin?
Well, initially it can be. The price you pay when you get high is trust. But we now know that in high enough quantities, oxytocin can overcome dopamine and break that loop of addiction.
That's great to know.
And that's part of what we can do for each other. You know, I'm a psychiatrist. I prescribe a lot of medicines, but this is one medicine I don't need to prescribe.
Mm-hmm.
We can remind someone of their value at every moment in time. And for parents out there who may be at home with their kids during Corona, you can do this for your kids. And the kids, if you're listening, you can do this for your parents. At every moment in time, you can remind someone of their value. And whenever you remind someone of their value, you increase your own value.
Thank you for that. That's absolutely. And especially as you brought that up, I know that right now our listeners, and including myself, have found it extremely challenging during these times because, well, there's no separation anymore between, work and home. A lot of us are working at home, and it all kind of bleeds in together. And I need my connections with other, face-to-face adults just to have some sort of perspective, and, you combine the child rearing, you combine that with the educational stuff that has to take place still. And it can get, pretty stressful at times. And one thing that I think out of all this that we're going to start doing on Sunday evenings with my family is sitting down for, it doesn't have to be more than 5 or 10 minutes. We're going to start this Sunday and begin a ritual of what we're going to call gratitude. These are things that I'm grateful for. And at the end of that, we're also going to say, this is one thing that I think is great about you. And I'm looking forward to that.
I love it. I think that's a great idea. I sure hope many people listen to this and just start doing that. It's a wonderful idea. Gratitude is one of the things that keeps people alive and joyful. We know this. There are papers that have shown this, that folks who are seniors have 4 things that have really kept them going. The first is gratitude, waking up every day and being grateful. The second is passion, having something that you're passionate about, something you love to do. The third thing is having someone to share that passion with. And then the fourth thing is just being in the moment. We're going to think about the future. We can think about the past. But, as John Lennon said, life is what happens to you when you make another plans. Enjoy the moment. There's something really remarkable about this coronavirus. And I think what it's done, obviously it's horrible. Many people are dying and it's a tragedy. But it's also shown us that we have much more in common than separates us. We're one tribe. It's called humanity. One tribe. And this especially with what you guys are doing with Landmark Recovery Radio. Because
appreciate
so many folks out there, absolutely, because the folks out there who are listening may have someone in recovery at home or someone who is unavailable to reach because you used to go over to their home. Or you may be the person who's struggling yourself, wondering, how am I going to stay sober in this time? There's so much stress. I want to come to this right now because, remember, part of our brains right now in Corona time are limbic. We are in a survival mode. We're in this irrational survival mode. But the limbic system is also where addictions start.
Right.
So we need to shift to our prefrontal cortex. We need to think this one through. And right now, for folks who are in recovery, there's things you can do. You know that there are online sources. I have some patients who are doing this really fun thing. They're going to AA meetings all over the world.
Absolutely.
From their home. They're
It's
checking
wonderful.
out a meeting in Florida. They're checking out a meeting in California. They're checking out a meeting in London. They're checking out a meeting where there's a language they speak. And it's so much fun because this recovery is global. And Corona is letting people know that mental health and addiction are things that we have to address. I am so worried about many of my kids right now because I know that they're at risk. We have kids who are at risk of relapsing. We have more kids at risk of first-time substance use, which puts them on that potential path.
Right.
So we can send messages to people. We can send a message that you're not alone, that there will always be someone there for you. And like I like to say now is, I will have your back, just 6 feet apart.
Right. Right. I appreciate all that. And I also want to come back to something that you mentioned too about what gets you out of bed each day. You mentioned something I thought that was very apropos to this conversation, and you mentioned the word passion. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective. Adolescents are just trying to figure it out. Like they're just trying to figure out who the heck they are and what's it all about. And are there things that you've seen where you've identified or worked with adolescents at a young age who, man, they found something and they're running with it and they are absolutely on fire about whatever it is? Counteract that though sometimes with parents who I'll call it get in the way sometime and think that that's great, Johnny, but this is really what you need to be focused on. How do you help parents resolve that, or adolescents or a systemic family work through some of this stuff when clearly this might be a really good thing for the adolescent?
So first, let me say that what I say to parents is never let anybody tell you that you are not the expert in your kid.
Okay.
You are the expert. People like me are just the professionals. But the most important person is the kid. And I also say it is much more rewarding to be amazed at who your child is than disappointed in who they are not. Be amazed. Be amazed at them. If they have an interest in something, be interested in it. Join them with it. If it's a passion for them, if it's a video game. I mean, right now, so many kids are out of school. And what we found is for the school systems that are sending work home for the kids, if a parent says you have to do it at 9:00 and the kids are resistant, work with your kids. Say, hey, Timmy, what time do you think would be a good time for you to do the homework? Let's figure it out. Let's make it a time that's good for you. And then kids, they have buy-in and they feel empowered. And then they feel they can trust you. And then they feel like they can get the work done. Remember, kids want to please their parents. Right. They really do. You may not always think that as a parent, but believe me, when it comes down to it, that's what they want. Why do you think kids hide doing drugs? They're not hiding drugs because they feel bad. They don't want their parents to have a different view of them.
Right.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, right now, parents, you have an opportunity that you may not have again for a long time. You've got your kids at home and enjoy it. Join with them. Learn about them. Find things that they love to do and learn how to do it with them.
I appreciate all that. Yep. I want to talk a little bit about Drug Story Theater because that's something that you founded and created. You mentioned it a little bit. Tell us a little bit more, though, about the purpose behind it and why you started it.
So what we do at Drug Story Theater is we take teenagers in the early stages of recovery, we teach them improvisational theater, and then we use something called psychodrama, and they create their own scripted shows about the seduction of, addiction to, and recovery from drugs and alcohol. And they perform these shows for middle schools and high schools. So the treatment of one becomes the prevention of many. That's our slogan. The treatment of one becomes the prevention of many. In between each scene of the show, the kids step out of character and they do PowerPoint presentations teaching the audience about the neuroscience of adolescent brain development. Similar to what I've been talking about here.
Right.
That stuff are in kid-friendly slides, and it's their peers teaching about it. This is what happens in my brain. All the kids in the audience take a pre-show neuroscience quiz, and then they take the same quiz after the show, and we measure how kids who learn about their brain change their perception. We're not trying to scare anyone.
Right.
We're just trying to teach them that, this is what's going on in your brain. So yeah, you can get high, but the price you pay is trust. If what we're really asking you to do is, if you are going to use, we'd rather you didn't, but if you are, just wait until you're older. And that at every moment in time, if low self-esteem is the greatest risk factor, you can remind someone of their value. And whenever you do remind someone of their value, increase your own. So imagine a room of 800 kids, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders in a school.
Right.
And I've got my kids up there, and they're doing the performance. After the show, there's a talk back, which I moderate. And so at some point in the talk back, I'll say, okay, will these kids stand up? And we'll have like 200 kids stand up. And I'll say, that's how many kids in this room are at risk for addiction right now, just because the way your brain is developing. Not about morality, it's about mortality. I don't know which one. You don't know which one. It could be you, could be your brother, your sister, your neighbor, your best friend, your worst enemy. We don't know. So we're asking you to wait. Then we'll do this. We'll say, okay, for the next 30 seconds, whoever's closest to you, who's ever sitting next to you or behind you, in front of you, just say something nice about them. And the room erupts into laughter. I mean, just thinking about it, doesn't it make you smile just thinking about it?
Absolutely.
All these kids saying this, and we calm them down. We say, okay, is there anyone that's not smiling right now? They're all smiling. And we say to them, you know what's going on in your brain right now? Oxytocin.
Right.
That's how easy it is. That's positive peer pressure.
Right.
That's how you can help somebody else. So bullies, if the best a bully can do is try to feel valuable by making you feel less valuable, what's going on with them?
Right.
It's not about you. You're fine.
Right.
But you can help that bully. Maybe something's going on at their home.
Right.
Maybe something's going on in the rest of their world that they just don't feel good about themselves. So that's what Drug Story Theater is doing. So we've performed for over 40,000 kids in Massachusetts. And I am so glad that we're doing this now, because if you go to our website, www.drugstorytheater.org, and go to the Contact Us page, we now have a free video of our show.
Awesome.
That we want to get in front of every single 6th grader and their parent in the United States. Because we want to stop the next opioid crisis. And even though the focus right now is on corona, coronavirus is not an immunization against addiction. We can't take our eye off of it. We can't take our eye off of it. So I started Drug Story Theater because of my own past. Not because of addiction, but because of theater. So, as I said in the introduction, many years ago, in the 1970s, early 1972, I was on a TV show called Zoom. It was a national television show. We won 2 Emmy Awards. And I became enthralled with just this feeling that you get when you're performing. And later, as I studied medicine and then psychiatry, I realized that I was experiencing oxytocin.
Sure.
And I thought, what if we can use this feeling to help kids? Because the treatment of one becomes the prevention of many. When those kids are performing in front of an audience of strangers, the courage it takes for them to share their story is amazing. And that courage is appreciated by that audience of strangers. And they stand up and give a round of applause. And when they do that applause, that is treatment for my kids.
Sure.
And the oxytocin is rushing through their brains. And they are
and they won't forget that.
Pleasure. They won't forget it. They won't, because pleasure and memory are connected. Memory is in the limbic system.
Right.
That's why drugs are so dangerous, because you get that little, hey, this feels good. You know, a lot of people start using drugs or alcohol to avoid a feeling.
Right.
You know, they avoid feeling angry, anxious, or sad. Now, I'm going to ask you, because I know you're a marriage counselor and studied this stuff, but does the name Pavlov ring a bell?
Oh, absolutely.
So you get the joke. So Pavlov, remember, conditioned dogs to salivate when they heard the sound of a bell. He took these dogs, he showed them food, and they would salivate. He then showed them food and rang a bell, and they would salivate. He could then just ring the bell, no food around,
right? And
they would salivate. They had associated the sound of the bell with getting food. It's the same with drugs. You get a trigger. The trigger is a memory. Right. And that memory can activate a tiny little blip of dopamine. A tiny little blip of dopamine that goes off and says, hey, remember what this did? You can go get high.
Well, and I want to ask you a question too, because you mentioned as you were doing these presentations that you were moderating the question and answer discussion piece at the back end. And what I know to be true, especially now in our digital age, that access to information is right there. And I'm sure that you've probably been presented with this question before, when a young adolescent or, on the tail end adolescence, 8th grader, going into high school, asks the question, so Dr. Shrand, what about weed? I've heard all this stuff that it helps you out and, I don't think it's that bad, how do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I usually punt it over to our kids.
Okay.
Because the kids will say that 95%, because I ran an adolescent program, with kids on heroin. And the heroin kids will say, 95% of us started with weed. It doesn't mean that 95% of kids who smoke weed will go on to heroin, but 95%. And in one of our shows, the kids did an improv that got written into the script. It's a discussion between two kids in a treatment center. One of them's there, he says, I shouldn't be, I just smoke weed. And the other kid said, yeah, I started with weed. And the other kid says, well, I'm not like you. I'll never do heroin. And the kid on heroin said, yeah, that's what I said. He said, well, I'm really not like you. And then the kid on heroin says, if you're not like me, stop smoking weed.
Right.
It's a gateway. There's 3 gateways.
Yeah.
Weed, alcohol, and nicotine. These are the gateways. And kids, right, I'm in Massachusetts, because I'm speaking to you from Massachusetts, weed is legal. It's not even just decriminalized. It's not medicalized. It's now been recreationalized. And for me, it's as if on that voting day, it's as if all these adults went into the voting booth and just stopped using their prefrontal cortex.
Right.
They just stopped thinking, well, what will happen next? Well, what's the message I'm sending to my kids? I tell them that weed's legal. Alcohol's legal. Guns are legal. Prescription pain medicine is legal. It doesn't make it safe. So we're asking the kids, please just wait until your brain is a little more developed before you smoke weed. If you're going to smoke at home.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you mentioned the word gateway, because I think that that's a term that gets used a lot. And my interpretation of it is, like you said, you're not going to just decide, I smoke some weed, now it's time to do heroin. I think what happens a lot of the times is that you begin to be in these circles, right, where there are, there's alcohol, there's weed, and then a kid shows up or an adult shows up or someone shows up at let's just call it a party, right? And there's a little bit of cocaine there. And it's like, if you're predisposed and you've kind of got that risk-taking piece about you anyway, it's like, well, why not? Let's just give it a shot, right? and you like it. You like it a lot, you know. And from that point on, it's like as though the bar has been raised on the amount of pleasure it takes to feel really damn good.
Yeah. And, you know, Zach, we talk about this in Drugs Free Theater in one of the PowerPoint presentations. So how do we know this stuff that we started talking about? Why is the adolescent brain at such risk for addiction? Because of some studies that were done early on where they took these adults and they put them in an MRI machine, fMRI machine, where they could measure the way their brain waves and brain activity was. And they showed them pictures of a great white shark. And they would say to the adult, would you swim with this shark? And the adult says, there's no way I'm going to swim with a shark. It'll bite me in half. And when they looked at the brain patterns, the prefrontal cortex was lighting up. The adult was able to anticipate what will happen. They put kids, adolescents, teenagers in a machine like that, an fMRI machine. They showed them the exact same picture. And they said to the kid, would you swim with this shark? And the kid goes, well, maybe. What are you talking about? It's a shark. Yeah, but you know, if the weather's warm, if I got a new bathing suit, if Debbie is there, I am so swimming with that shark. Yeah, it's a shark. And in the adolescent brain, the limbic system is lighting up like crazy.
Right.
So that's how we know the limbic system's more in charge of the brain. Mm-hmm. So to get to your point, Zach, a kid can go to a party. A kid can come from a perfectly good home, be getting great grades, be on the sports team or in the drama club or music or going to church. They go to a party and there's somebody cutting up a line. And the person hands the kid the mirror and the straw and says, here, swim with this shark. So you're right. That's what it is. Yeah.
And you bring up some stuff that I was thinking through just as you were mentioning that. There's something that sticks out to me, and it's this idea of belonging, right? Because belonging is I think I'd say vastly different than fitting in. And I think that there's many kids, adolescents who yearn to belong. They scream, I just want to belong to something, a tribe. You mentioned that word. Versus, you know, if you just fit in, your sense of identity is lost. And at an adolescent development, that's what the majority, I think, of adolescents are really looking for.
You know, there's a wonderful T-shirt. It says, you are unique, just like everybody else. You know, so yes, I think that belonging is a very important part. And that's part of what Drugs Free Theater does for kids, is they feel that they have a place where they belong that's a no judgment zone. Right. So what I can tell kids is, you know, you're valuable, which means that you can belong wherever you want to. You don't need to be picked for a group. You don't need to be chosen. You don't need to just fit in and blend. You can be who you are. And that part has to come also from parents, from adults, from other important people in their lives who are always reminding them of their value. You know, there's something called resilience. Right? Resilience is when somebody has gone through terrible trauma, but they still are managing and they're living their lives. Every one of those resilient kids had at least one adult in their life who saw them as valuable. This theory of mind thing is so important. I'm telling you, Zach, theory of mind is the foundation for everything. And the reason it's so important is because it's how we assess our belonging in that tribe. Do you see me as a valuable part of this? Am I contributing? And what's cool is the more you contribute, the more valuable you are. Right. One of my phrases for our Drugs Free Theater kids and for everyone in recovery, contribute to society to help with your sobriety.
Well, I had the pleasure of yesterday participating with some of our staff in making masks for the homeless population here in town. And I'll tell you what, I find it hard to walk away from something like that without absolutely feeling gratified to contribute back and be of service. So I appreciate that.
And thank you so much for that. I mean, really, it is so important to be able to do that. We can help each other. We're a remarkably helpful and compassionate group of human beings when we want to be. But unfortunately, we can also be just the opposite.
Yeah. And
that's part of why we have stigma, where somehow we say, you are not valuable. Get out of my group.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things I say is addiction is not a crime, but can lead to them. And one of the biggest crimes is that we turn our backs on people who need us the most.
Yeah.
Now, I want to just stay on this for a moment again, doing the talking thing, but this oxytocin thing and theory of mind is really important because we know that in addiction, what happens is theory of mind begins to get affected. So there's some really fascinating studies of women who were addicted to cocaine. And there was a direct correlation between their ability to use theory of mind and the degree of their addiction. So why is this important? Is because if a family member doesn't know that, they're going to take it personally when the other person who's addicted seems to be choosing drugs over them.
Right.
And they can then feel less valuable. And then they can get angry, anxious, or sad. So it's really important for people to understand some of the brain science that's going on. It's not about morality. It's about mortality. It's the way the brain works.
Dr. Shrand, where would I find out if I was inclined to learn a little bit more about this topic, theory of mind? Is there a book, website, or anything like that?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. Actually, I have a book called Do You Really Get Me?
Okay.
Do You Really Get Me? Finding Value in Yourself and Others Through Empathy and Connection. So you can get that on Amazon. If you go to a Drug-Free Theater website, we'll try to figure out a way to get you one. But really, if you go to the SAMHSA websites and any other websites, if you just look it up, Theory of Mind, it's everywhere. We know a lot about it. We've been researching this for a while. What's fascinating is that there may be patients out there or families who have interaction with folks with autism. So the difficulty with theory of mind is the core difficulty in autism. But in my book, Do You Really Get Me? It explains that theory of mind comes in two parts. The second part is empathy. That part develops 18 months to 3 years of age. But the first part that develops even younger than that is, what do you think about me? Think about babies. Babies don't understand a word you're saying. You can say to a baby, and I'm not saying people should do this, but you can go to a baby, you are the ugliest thing I've ever seen. You're so ugly, you little ugly thing, you. And they'll smile. Right. Because the way you're saying it, the tone, the intonation, they are interested. They don't understand the word. Please don't say that to your baby. But we're all interested in what people think about us. And the person who's addicted is no different. It's just that they have a struggle with empathy because of the way the drugs are interfering with their prefrontal cortex. The limbic system's taken over. The part that's really important about this is, for folks who are struggling with addiction, I want to just explain one thing. You're going to get triggered. Right now, with coronavirus, you're going to get triggered. You're going to feel bored. You're going to feel angry, anxious, or sad. All those things that you were trying to avoid to begin with. But in your brain, the limbic system doesn't plan. The limbic system takes control of your prefrontal cortex so you can figure out how to get the drug or alcohol. There is a pause. There will always be a pause so you can make a different plan. Think it through. Put your hand on your forehead. What will happen next if I use now? You can do it.
I appreciate that. Listen, it has been a pleasure to speak with you today, Dr. Joe. And again, your website for the Drug Story Theater is drugstorytheater.org.
Correct. Yep. And I have a website that also, drshrand.com, but go to drugstorytheater.org and check it out. I would be appreciative. And really, we're happy to help people all over the country to get Drug Story Theater in front of your sixth grader. We want to do it. We're there.
It's needed. You're listening to Landmark Recovery Radio, your source for addiction and recovery news and knowledge. You can find us online wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe to get the most up-to-date information from leading experts. We have guest Dr. Alex Elswick joining us on the show today. Dr. Elswick is a tireless advocate for people with substance use disorders. He earned a BA in history from Center College here in Kentucky, as well as a master's and PhD from the University of Kentucky. His knowledge and experience with addiction is very multifaceted. His professional experience, nonprofit work, and research agenda all focus on long-term recovery. Very important topic there. But most importantly, he is himself a person in long-term recovery from the chronic disease of addiction. Great to always have a friend of Bill on the show. Welcome on the show, Dr. Elswick.
Hey, Zach, thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So this is a very interesting topic because I think it's something that it has a lot of different connotations, I guess. What does long-term mean? And what qualifies all that. So I'm interested in getting into I wanted to raise that up first. It looks like you have, I would say, a wealth of experience with substance abuse prevention, as well as, as I mentioned, a personal connection as a person in long-term recovery yourself. Story shaped your professional and nonprofit work, would you say?
Yeah, so I got addicted to pain pills after I had wisdom teeth surgery. I had elective surgery, had my wisdom teeth removed. I was prescribed oxycodone. I got a second prescription for oxycodone after I got dry sockets in those wounds in my mouth. So they gave me a second script. Mm-hmm. Anyways, it was plenty of opioids to get addicted, and ended up that typical trajectory from taking opioids orally to snorting them to injecting them, and went through 5 treatment centers and jail, and was homeless and slept under a bridge at the very end. Wow. And all that kind of, so in that way, my addiction was very typical. But I think the experience that I had in recovery that's taught me a lot and really has shaped the work that I do is in the fact that I know that my recovery wasn't typical. And the reason it wasn't typical is because I had access to so many resources simply because I'm a privileged person, right? I was just born into circumstances where I had access. So to answer your question, a lot of the work that I focus on is a concept called recovery capital, which is sort of like saying what resources you have access to, and trying to build that for other people.
Got it. I'm curious to hear also, how old were you when you had your wisdom teeth pulled?
Yeah, I was 18 years old. So you mentioned being friends of Bill. I went to my first Friends of Bill meeting at 18 years old, 3 years before I could legally drink. So I've been around this for a little while,
Got it. It's just it's a kind of a sidebar conversation here, but so, I think that I was talking to another friend of mine, another colleague about this last week, and there's quite a few people, I would say younger folks too today, who often get turned off by what we call 12-step recovery because they have a bad experience in a particular meeting. Okay. And it's automatically often unfortunately for a lot of people written off. It's like, I'm not going to go back there. It was terrible, etc. And my experience was very similar. I went to my first meeting when I was about 21, 22 at the suggestion of a person that I was actually using a lot with. And I know, right? And I went to a meeting and I was, like I said, 21, 22, and I had no idea what the format was. I just know that it was called a round robin. You're familiar. So, it's coming around to me, and my quote temporary sponsor at the time was sitting to the right of me. And it comes to me, and I stand up and I said, I'm Zach. And, I was saying this in probably front of 40 or 50 people at the meeting. I was like, listen, guys, I don't really think that I'm an alcoholic. Okay. I just want to let you all know that, like, I'm trying to prove something to somebody here. And I just sit back down, So my temporary sponsor at the time, he literally stands up in the middle of the meeting and says to me, "What do you mean you don't know if you're an alcoholic or not?" And I just got way taken back by that, And I had people come up to me at the end of the meeting and, just saying, "Hey man, we're sorry that happened to you." I was like, this is really weird. So some bad stuff happened from that point forward, fast forward another 60 days to maybe 6 months. And I was actually working as a person who does lab tests at the Warren County Jail, right? So I was the guy that would watch you pee in the cup for the drug court folks there. Right. And I was using the entire time. And these people, they work there, they know, they're in recovery. They could probably tell that I was coming in just stoned or high or whatever.
Sure.
So I get fired from that job, naturally. And I was I was at the risk of really flunking out of, some, college or whatever it was. And I went to my meeting, and I know we're not supposed to promote it, and I'm not, but I'm just saying my experience at that meeting was I had drug tested a guy that same week, the same week that I got fired. And I saw him at the meeting, and he just comes up to me and he's like, "Zach?" I was like, "Yeah, man." He's like, "What are you doing here?" I was like, "I'm pretty sure I'm one of you guys." And without any hesitation at all, man, this guy, he had to be 6'5", probably 260, 250. He gives me just this embracing, just bear hug, man.
That's awesome.
And I knew at that point, man, I had arrived, dude. I had found the freaking place that I needed to, And I've been there ever since, Now, granted, I went back and forth. I was probably out for 5 or 6 years, where I hated 12-step recovery, and then I came back, and then 12-step recovery, man, recovery period has saved my life. I wouldn't have today. I wouldn't have the relationships, the family, the freedom that I have today unless it was for that. So this topic, this long-term recovery topic, is something I think that is super important for a lot of people.
No doubt. And AA is one of many pathways in recovery, but one of the things that makes it so valuable is that it's, number one, that it's free, and number two, that it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And you can go to any city in the country, mostly all over the world, and find a meeting whose structure resembles a meeting you've been to before, where you find people who speak a language you understand, and you find community. So one of the things people told me early on was find your tribe. And it kind of sounds like that's what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I want to go back. You mentioned that you now have, it sounds like you've had it for a while now, a wealth of experience, right, in terms of substance abuse prevention and recovery. I asked this question because I'm curious to hear. At 18, when you had your wisdom teeth pulled, what kind of conversation, if any, did you have with your doctor at the time, or dentist, or whoever it was, about the addictive qualities of which you were taking?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if memory serves, we had no conversation at all. There was no discussion about potential risks. I think particularly when you're a white suburban kid coming in with your mom, don't fit the mold of, our stereotype of addiction or whatever, someone who would become addicted. So it wasn't a conversation. And to be honest with you, I really don't extend blame to the oral surgeon or anyone. I just think they didn't have the training and experience and the understanding, and they'd been told to treat pain. So by God, they were treating pain,
Right. Well, and I think that we have a healthcare system too that's set up such. Now, it wasn't probably like this 40 or 50 years ago, but doctors can be held on the hook if they refuse to treat someone's pain, because then they risk potential liability, legal liability. Go ahead.
That relationship with pain and managed healthcare is really interesting and complicated. And when you look at the way that pain management became tied to like patient evaluations at hospitals, so now a hospital gets reimbursed more for patients who rate them highly when they treated their pain. So we've incentivized doctors essentially to prescribe pain medication. And
right.
I think we should have seen the writing on the wall, but didn't.
When we talk about as we kind of alluded to here, the disease of addiction, how does a reliance on pain medication turn into something that can be categorized as a disease?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So there's a distinction to be made there between physical dependence and an opioid use disorder. So most anybody who takes opioids for a prolonged period of time will develop physical dependence, which means if they were to stop taking them abruptly, they would experience withdrawal symptoms, constipation, nausea, things like that. When we start talking about an opioid use disorder or an addiction, we're really talking about when your drug use crosses over to impair social and occupational functioning. And in layman's terms, it just means when it affects you at home, when it affects you at school, when it affects you at work, when it affects your relationships, then it's becoming a problem. So in a sense, we sort of say it's not a problem until you say it's a problem. And that's part of the reason why it's helpful to have people's investment in their own treatment and recovery.
As we mentioned at the beginning too, you talk a lot about prevention, right? And I think that important conversations that never happens is the informed discussion from family members to their kids about the risks involved with becoming dependent or becoming, especially if you have a family of addiction in your family, the risk involved with that. What's been your experience in working with people? That's getting better, like that conversation is starting to happen more?
Do you mean like with parents and children?
Yeah, with parents, but even with, with parents who have adult children who they see now going down a path that's pretty typical for, addiction. I
think fortunately, there's an awareness now about the fact that there is a risk and that opioid pain medication isn't safe. And even some pretty good research suggesting it's really not terribly effective at treating pain at all anyways, relative to some other approaches. But one of the things I do see is parents taking an interest in things like safe prescription storage. So how do I take care of my prescriptions? How do I make sure I get rid of unused medication? Parents coming to understand the need to have naloxone on hand, even if they don't have a child who's using opioids, just for everyone to have naloxone. So I definitely see the conversation happening more so, but it's one that every parent should have with their kid. And I think you brought up a great point. Part of it should include their genetic history.
Let's go back to this discussion around opioid pain relievers, especially for call it short-term management of pain. How common is it for someone who's been prescribed opioid pain relievers for that short-term pain management to become addicted and unable to stop?
That's it's startling actually, the statistics. So Sean and colleagues, some researchers analyzed some CDC data in 2017, and they found that based on a one-day supply of opioids, 6% of folks will still be using opioids a year later. Based on a 5-day supply, 10% will still be using a year later. And based on a 10-day supply, 20% will still be using a year later. So that last number, a 10-day supply, is roughly the supply that I ended up with for my prescription. And I was the 1 in 5 who got addicted.
Wow. So 20% is huge.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, even just, bumping it, we're not even talking about a 30 or 60 day supply, but you said, was it 10 days and it goes up to 20%?
That's right.
That's crazy, man. Wow.
It is. And important you bring up that 30-day and 60-day supplies are not uncommon. That's not considered, or at least traditionally hasn't been considered an excessive supply. But when you look at the data, particularly for short-term pain management, there's really no sense.
Talk to me a little bit further about what you meant by studies are showing that the more opioids that you take, it actually hurts your ability to deal with pain.
Yes. So there's a desensitized process, a process of desensitization that happens where if you, or sensitization rather, the opposite, sensitization where as you are taking opioids in sort of dulling pain receptors in a sense, they become more and more sensitized such that now if you don't have an opioid on board, you're hypersensitive to pain because your body becomes accustomed to needing an opioid to ward off some of the pain. So it's also part of the reason why people early in recovery from opioid addictions are hypersensitive to a lot of different things. They can be psychologically hypersensitive, but also physically sensitive to ailments.
And I would presume that you're also not just talking about physical pain. Are you also talking about things like stimulus, like, loud noises, bright lights, things like that too?
That's right, because we also early in recovery have, this is an annoying fancy term, but a hypersensitive hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal axis. Basically what that is just your fight or flight response. So basically people early in recovery are constantly perceiving threats in their environment as if their well-being is threatened, which makes you just very edgy and sensitive and anxious and adds to the distress of being in recovery.
Let's talk about medical procedures, because there's a good chance that, most of us at some point in our lives are going to have one done. So if we're prescribed opiates after a medical procedure, what steps can people take to avoid becoming addicted while, still managing their pain?
I think the first step is to begin an open communication with your healthcare provider. Acknowledge that you have some concern about the risks, particularly if you have a genetic history. I would ensure that every single individual who is prescribed an opioid is also prescribed naloxone. There's no question that those should be prescribed in tandem. And then I think if you're a person in recovery, it doesn't mean you can't take opioids. It doesn't mean there isn't a time when you may need them, but there are certainly some strategies people in recovery may want to employ after a medical procedure. For instance, some people choose to let a sponsor or another trusted person hold their medication and dispense it for them. And that may feel a little bit patronizing or kind of condescending, but I think it's an effective way to say, hey, maybe I'm not the one that needs to be in control of this medication. Other people may not need to take that approach, but I do think it can be a helpful strategy.
I'm curious to hear, because you mentioned something that kind of I think absolutely necessary. I think it's a great idea. This prescribing rather of naloxone does get an opioid prescription medication. Is this going to take a change in culture, you think, providers to just understand the value of why it is that we would prescribe naloxone?
It is, and it's changing. Maybe not as rapidly as we like, but it is changing. I'm a member of KYSOS, which is the University of Kentucky has an opioid stewardship committee whose job is to consult with hospitals on how to be more effective stewards of opioids, how to make sure we prescribe more carefully. And one of those recommendations is to make sure that naloxone is always prescribed, because what the research shows is as soon as you hand someone a prescription for opioids, you've increased their likelihood of dying of an opioid overdose by a significant percent. Well,
I think that one thing that I've come to understand, at least about, doctors, PAs, nurse practitioners, if they're just going through medical school and training for that matter, and they don't sort of, I want to say, specialize in addiction or addiction medicine, they don't receive a lot of training, right, for understanding these things that we've talked about today. So if your doctors, you mentioned it's important to have that communication with them. But if you feel like you aren't getting what you need in terms of an educational piece around this, and it is important, who else should you turn to?
Yeah, I think always making sure that you go to legitimate sources to get information. So I would stick to CDC or National Institute of Drug Abuse, some of those more vetted organizations. I think that's important, but you bring up such a good point, Zach, which is sometimes we forget that we're responsible for our own healthcare, and we feel like, it's sort of the doctor's responsibility, but really we ask doctors to do so much and to be experts in so many different things and a jack of all trades. And you're right that they don't get a great deal of specialized addiction training. So in many ways we got to be woke. We got to be responsible for our own and maybe initiate that conversation.
A pretty crass analogy, but I think of doctors as you go to your generalist, your PCP, right? Mm-hmm. And they're good. They're really good. They help you out. They do your yearly physical, etc. But it's almost like okay, I've got these physical problems, but I think that they're caused by mental health issues that I have, and automatically it's something like where, okay, well, I need to get you over to the parts, the transmission shop, a la our psychiatrist, right? Right. And I think that you're correct. It is a person's responsibility to do their due diligence. But the question I still have is, should doctors receive more training specifically? I'm talking about PCPs as an example on addiction. Yes. Yeah. And in addition to the fact that everyone needs more training and more education, which is just low-hanging fruit, primary care providers in particular, probably above and beyond other kinds of healthcare providers, really should have training because they're going to be very likely to encounter it. It's going to be one of the first points of contact where a person with a substance use disorder may actually have an opportunity to interact with their healthcare provider. Absolutely. Well, this is a conversation that could probably go on, and it's so important to talk about this stuff, especially, I think everybody's focus is long, if you're in treatment and you're encountering someone who has a substance use problem, long-term recovery is the goal for most people. It should be. So I mentioned you're a friend of Bill. How long do you have in the program? So it'll be, it's been 6.5 years, it'll be 7 years, September 13th. And it's been every day's a gift. Fantastic, man. Wonderful. Well, it's been a pleasure, Dr. Elswick, having you on the show today. And thank you for coming on. I really appreciate this. Zach, thanks so much to you and to Landmark for having me on. I really appreciate it. If you know someone struggling with an addiction and are searching for answers, visit us at landmarkrecovery.com to learn more about substance abuse programs that are both saving lives and empowering families. And until next week, I'm Zach Crouch with Landmark Recovery Radio.
Thank you for tuning in to Recovery Radio. New content for this program is available every Tuesday at 12 noon Eastern Time and 9 a.m. Pacific Time, with all episodes available on demand on the Voice America Health and Wellness channel and through our content partners, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Google Play podcasts. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review so we can continue to create quality content to help save 1 million lives in the next 100 years. You don't need to struggle through addiction alone. Live the life you dreamed on the road to recovery.